this year is going to be the political campaign that will be decided on by podcasts, and particularly because I think the podcasts have the capacity this election for reaching people and allowing, sort of dissident and insurgent candidates like myself to end run the corporate media monolith.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking with writer, attorney, environmentalist, and 2024 presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We discuss how the Democratic Party has become one of fear and ideology, its inexplicable conclusion with legacy media and big pharma, how the COVID-19 pandemic became an issue of tribal allegiance, the use of the doomsday climate narrative for political gains, what can actually be done with renewable energy, and why the era of Kennedy Democrats can not only be revived, but uniting for Americans across boundaries, both physical and philosophical. What made you decide to throw your hat in the ring on the presidency at this point?
Well, I saw the country going in a direction and my political party going in a direction that was very troubling to me. The country, one, really kind of needs a reboot. But the role of my political party, I felt like the Democrats kind of got derailed and became the party suddenly and mysteriously of war when they were always skeptical of the military-industrial complex. They became the party of censorship, which is abhorrent to every definition of liberalism. They became the party of fear, which is against our, traditions. Franklin Roosevelt, in his 1932 inaugural address, said that the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, and he understood that fear is a weapon of totalitarian elements and totalitarian control. It became the party of the neocons, which again was antithetical. The neocons were Republican, very, belligerent, pugnacious foreign policy about subduing the world and establishing hegemony through violence. It became the party of Wall Street. President Biden has surrounded himself with Wall Street and the party that had forgotten its roots in the middle class of our country and started regarding people, the cops, the firefighters, the union members, the people who were the bedrock of the Democratic Party as deplorables. And all of those trends and others were disturbing to me. And I actually, Jordan, started thinking about running before it was really viable, before I considered it viable, but just to be able to take advantage of the fact that you're protected somewhat from censorship if you're running for president. There's actually federal rules that make it illegal for the network TV to censor presidential candidates. And but my wife would never have let me run for president if it was not if I didn't intend to win. And then last spring, a pollster named Jeremy Zogby, who runs one of the biggest polling houses in North America, and had been polling me without my knowledge for several months, asked to see me, and he sat down with me and showed me the polling results that showed a very clear path that I could have till victory. And with those, I was able to, over time, persuade my wife and my kids that this was a good idea. And I think at this point, they're pretty happy with, the last 2 months.
How are you doing in the polls at the moment, as far as you can tell, with credible polls?
Well, the public poll, I average about 20%, which is good. I mean, my candidacy is not being treated as as serious by the mainstream media. I think maybe it is a little bit more so, but it was originally dismissed as kind of a fringe candidacy. But I'm actually doing much better than DeSantis, Governor DeSantis does against Trump. I'm doing much better against Biden. So it's I think that is just a media bias, and our internal poll numbers are much, much better. And I think the most significant thing for Democrats over the long term is that our internal polls show that I do much better against President Trump than President Biden does. So I beat him by almost double the percentage that President Biden does. And I do even better against Governor DeSantis. So I think that, if the public polling reflects that, I think that that's going to be very persuasive to a lot of Democrats who really see the election as just a battle to keep Donald Trump from retaking the White House again. And I think a lot of Democrats who don't like me, I think mainly because of the propaganda that has dominated, the very, very negative propaganda, negative portrayals of me, and the misinterpretations of my viewpoints, which have dominated the media and the public consciousness over the past several years, that will begin to recede a little the more that people see of me, and the more that, if the polling shows that I am more likely to beat President Trump than President Biden, I think it will force a lot of Democrats to take a second look at me.
Why do you think that people feel that you might be a better alternative to Trump than Biden is? Like, what is it about what you bring to the table that's making you more credible on that front?
Well, I think the reason my numbers show that is that I've been able to bridge the divide between Republicans and Democrats. So a lot of my supporters, I think I do better than any candidate with independents, which are now the biggest political party. And I appeal to a lot of Republicans as well. And I don't think, President Biden can do that. And if you just do the math, in the end, it's likely that I'll get almost all the Democrats who vote. If I'm right, if it's me against, let's say, President Trump, the likelihood is that most Democrats would vote for me and that he will get very little crossover. Whereas I will still get a lot of Republican votes, and I'll dominate the independent votes, and I think that will continue. I mean, that is not, that observation, or that is not just an artifact of our polling, but it's it's reflected in conversations that I have every single day of people approaching me in airports, on airplanes, when I'm doing, when I'm in the countryside, which I have to go to a lot, in rural areas, urban areas, I'm getting a strong response, and the response is across the board. So I think it's true, the polling is reflecting something that's really happening.
Right. Well, it isn't obvious to me, and this leads into another line of questioning, exactly why you're running on the Democrat ticket, because as you just pointed out, your policies, at least in principle, could appeal to Republicans as well, and that might make you a unique candidate on the Democrat side. I guess I'm curious about so there's an analogy, I believe, between what's happened to the universities and what's happened to the Democrats. So what I saw happen in the universities was that the administration took over the faculty. The faculty retreated in 3,000 microsteps, and the administration moved forward. And that happened over about a 25-year period until the administration had captured the universities completely. And then the DEI types took over the administration. And it looks to me like something analogous happened within the Democrats. Like, I worked with the Democrats for a long time in California trying to help Democrat messages.
By DEI, do you mean?
Diversity, equity, and inclusivity.
Okay.
Yeah, the social justice warrior types within the universities. And so what I saw among the Democrats that I worked with was that they were unable to draw a dividing line between the moderate types and the radicals. So, and this is something maybe I'll push you about. So, for example, I went to Washington. I talked to a lot of Democrats, senators and congressmen, about what I saw happening in the broad public sphere, but also in the Democrat Party. And I asked them this question: when does the left go too far? And none of them were able to answer. And even though it's completely obvious that the left can go too far, I mean, that's one of the cardinal lessons of the 20th century. And I suggested that the left goes too far when it pushes equity. And all I got as a response from the Democrats, senators and congressmen alike was, well, the people who say equity, they just mean equality of opportunity. And that's not what they mean. They mean equality of outcome, and that's not the same thing at all. And I saw in that inability to draw that distinction part of the reason that the Democrats have shifted in the direction that you described, in the direction that seems to be opposed in many ways to the best interests of both the working class and the middle class, but also characterized by this incredible strain of illiberalism and corporate fascist collusion, the sort of thing that you document, for example, in the relationship between the power elites and big pharma. And so my sense on the Democrat side, I couldn't shift the Democrats to the point, the ones that I was talking to the point where they would draw a distinction between them and the radicals. It just didn't seem possible. And so why do you think, I don't think the universities are salvageable, by the way. So why do you think the Democrats are salvageable?
Well, I don't think we have a choice. We have a two-party system, and I'm a lifelong Democrat. I feel like my party's being taken away from me in some ways by the kind of ideologies, the extreme ideologies, and really, the departure of common sense that I think troubles you and a lot of, the things that you think about. And, but I mean, why do I think it's salvageable? Because I'm talking to people on the street. There's so many people who have responded to my candidacy positively because they see it as return to, being a Kennedy Democrats, the Democratic Party that they loved and that they, that they thought reflected their values, their ideologies, and their best interests and the best interests of this country. And that was likely to, build an America that they can be proud of, that their children can be proud of, that has moral authority around the world. And, all of the things that we'd like to see, that I think most people would like to see. I think the Democratic Party has been hijacked, as you say, by kind of some extreme ideologies and in some cases kind of irrational, thought patterns. And I think that kind of the idea of returning it to common sense is appealing to a lot of people. And I'm just thinking those things, and they seem to be reflected both in my polling and in the kind of reaction I get from people on the street and on Twitter, and so it's a melange of things that makes me feel that way. But I could be wrong.
Well, I mean, part of the reason that I was willing to work with the Democrats to begin with, and I did that for about 5 years, was because I think like you do, according to what you just said, that, well, you kind of have to work with the institutions that exist because those are the institutions that exist. And there seems to be some utility in trying to pull the Democrats, let's say, back towards the center as much as that's possible. But I found that I think we had some success in that regard. But it was in particular and I see this on the conservative side too, by the way, with the unwillingness to see, this is probably more true in Canada even, what is really at the core of this progressive ideology that stresses equity, for example, because equity is an unbelievably dangerous doctrine. And as far as I can tell, it's indistinguishable from the sort of Marxist ideas that swept across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and China, for that matter, in the 20th century, and that still prevail, certainly in China. And it isn't obvious to me at all that the Democrats have taken this with any degree of seriousness. And, that's producing all sorts of strange pathologies on the cultural front. Now, you've documented a fair bit, and this brings us into another area that's adjacent to that, I guess. You spent a lot of time, your last book, Letter to Liberals, I think I've got that title right, concentrated on the strange collusion that has occurred between the Democrats and Big Pharma. And this is also something I find completely inexplicable. Like 20 years ago, if you would have said that in 2020, the leftist types and the liberals, including the Democrats, would be colluding with Big Pharma, people would have thought you were completely out of your mind, because for an endless amount of time, the number one corporate enemies of people who were liberal or on the left were Big Pharma and big energy. And so how do you explain what happened in relationship to the liberal attitude towards Big Pharma during the COVID epidemic? Because I haven't been able to sort that out at all. What do you think's behind that?
Well, I watched that happen kind of like a slow motion train wreck. And you're right that traditionally, pharmaceutical industries are, it is a criminal enterprise. And, I'm not saying that lightly. The four principal companies, Merck, Sanofi, Pfizer, and Glaxo, that produce, for example, all the vaccines in America, have paid $35 billion collectively over the last decade in criminal penalties and, damages for lying to doctors, for defrauding regulators, for falsifying science, and for killing hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, the whole opioid crisis was engineered by the Sacklers and by the other big pharmaceutical companies, along with corrupt FDA officials. And that is a crisis that now kills this year killed 106,000 American kids, twice the number of kids that died during the 20-year Vietnam War. Vioxx is another good example. That was another symptom of the corrupt collusion between pharma and the regulatory agencies. And the capture of those agencies by that industry, which has become, the agencies themselves have become sock puppets for that industry. And they killed between 120,000 and 500,000 people with a drug they marketed as a headache medicine and arthritis medicine when they knew that it caused heart attacks. And they didn't tell the public that. They concealed that from the public. So, a lot of people would have said, oh, it caused heart attacks. Well, I'll take an aspirin, but they weren't allowed to make that choice because the pharma and the collusion, with the collusion of the regulators, took that information, deprived the public of informed consent. Now, the question is, Democrats knew that. There's more pharmaceutical lobbyists on Capitol Hill than there are congressmen, senators, and Supreme Court justices combined, more than any other industry. They give double in terms of lobbying what the next biggest industry gives, and it's easy for them to own Congress still. There was an ideological resistance among Democrats until a decade ago, or really a decade. What happened was that Democrats are always starved for money, for campaign money, because Republicans can take money from dirty industries and from, sort of people, disreputable people, from whether it's the oil industry, the tobacco industry, the NRA, or, things that a lot of Democrats consider disreputable. And they have unlimited money. The Democrats traditionally could only get big money, reliable big money, from two sources. One was the labor unions, and the other was the trial lawyers. And they don't have anywhere near the kind of money that these industries have to give away. And so something changed during Obamacare, and that was that the Obama administration and my uncle Ted Kennedy was chairing the Senate Health Committee at this time. So I watched this whole thing very carefully and was disturbed at that time. Because of the lobbying power of pharma, Obama could not get Obamacare passed without the cooperation of the pharmaceutical industry. So he basically had to make a golden handshake with the devil. And the agreement they made was that, number one, Obamacare is going to benefit you because it's going to pay for all of your products, the pharmaceutical drugs to Americans. Here was the key: we will not bargain over prices with you, which Medicare used to do. The Canadian government bargains when it provides health care to Canadians. It bargains, it gets really good deals, which is why Americans go to Canada to buy drugs, because they're much cheaper there. But here they could pay the top. They could charge the top rate, and the Obamacare would have to pay it. And that is how Obama got the pharmaceutical industry's support. And after that, it became permissible for Democrats to accept pharmaceutical money. The pharmaceutical money began pouring into the Democratic Party, but, on issues like vaccines, the Democrats and Republicans were pretty evenly split up till 2016. And then you had Trump run for presidency, and during his campaign, he, on several occasions, he mentioned that he believed that vaccines were causing autism. And this was anecdotal to him. He had 3 friends who were women who were mothers whose children had been completely healthy and then had regressed into, lost their language and regressed into stereotypical behavior of autism associated with autism after receiving MMR vaccines. And so he and his belief was that it was that the link was real. And he said it out loud on several occasions, I think 3 separate occasions. And at that time, anything that Trump said was immediately, the reaction of the Democratic Party is whatever he says, we got to do the opposite. So even though we've hated NAFTA for our entire, existence of our party, if Trump now says he hates NAFTA, we've got to start liking NAFTA. So that was kind of what happened. Was those pronouncements by Trump were put by the Democratic Party doyens into the same anti-science dumpster as his climate denial, and it became a tribal issue. And so that it was a culture war issue. If you thought vaccines cause autism, it meant you were a Republican, and if you thought they definitely did not, and that's been proven beyond any doubt, you were a Democrat. And there was no in between. There was no dialogue. There was no room for dissent or debate. It was a tribal issue, and it was life or death. And that's the way that I saw that history happen, because I watched the change in 2016.
President Trump recently issued a warning from his Mar-a-Lago home. Quote, "Our currency is crashing and will soon no longer be the world standard, which will be our greatest defeat, frankly, in 200 years. There are 3 reasons why the central banks are dumping the U.S. dollar. Inflation, deficit spending, and our insurmountable national debt. The fact is, there is one asset that has withstood famine, wars, and political and economic upheaval dating back to biblical times: gold. And you can own it in a tax-sheltered retirement account with the help of Birch Gold. That's right, Birch Gold will help you convert an existing IRA or 401k, maybe from a previous employer, into an IRA in gold. When currencies fail, gold is a safe haven. How much more time does the dollar have? Protect your savings with gold. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of happy customers. Text Jordan to 989898 and get your free info kit on gold. Again, text Jordan to 989898.
Okay, so you saw 2 things happen. You saw a collusion emerge because of the agreement that Obama made with big pharma companies, and then there was this twist that was thrown into it as a consequence of the Trump candidacy. So also, I'm wondering, it wasn't that long ago, well, I guess it's 20 years now, so it's some reasonable amount of time, that the laws in the United States were changed so that big pharma could advertise their products directly to the consumer. And that was actually a revolution in messaging. And now, as you pointed out in your last book, big pharma controls about 75% of the advertising on legacy media, and even more on the news shows. And so,
I think it's about 75% on the news shows. I'm not Sure. I think there are even bigger advertisers if you look at the entire sort of landscape. Automobiles may be bigger, but certainly on the evening news shows. The evening news is kind of is the perfect landscape to advertise pharmaceuticals, because everybody who watches the evening news, essentially the entire demographic, is over 60. Young, my kids would not dream of turning on the evening news. They get their news from from their screens. But the people who are sitting down and watching the evening news are your age and they're my age. And as you know, when you get to our age, you spend a lot of time at doctors, and you're on. And those people are on a lot of drugs, and so they're watching it. And Roger Ailes told me, I think it was in 2014, and he, of course, was the founder and CEO of Fox News. And I was trying to get, I had made or participated in the making of a documentary about the impacts of mercury in vaccines on neurodevelopmental disorders in children. This sudden epidemic that had begun in 1989 of neurodevelopmental disorders. And he had a relative who had been affected that he believed was vaccine injured. And he always would put me on his shows. I had this weird relationship with Roger Ailes because I had spent 3 months in a tent with him when I was 19 years old in Africa. And we had this friendship. He was a very clever, witty guy, and he had not started Fox News. He had just left the running the Nixon campaign communications, and he had stepped down from the Merv Griffin show. And but I had this lasting friendship with him, and he was a very loyal friend. And he would always make the hosts of Fox TV to put me on to talk about environmental issues. So I was the only environmentalist for a decade that was going on Fox News. And I looked at him kind of as a Darth Vader, of what he had done to American television and communications. But I still had this strange friendship with him. So he would always put me on. And I went to him to try to get on to talk about this documentary. He looked at it. His assistant, Mike Clemente, who was running the station at that time, the network looked at it, and both of them loved it. But he said, we can't let you on. And he told me at that time, he said, if any of my hosts independently let you on to talk about this, I would fire them. I would have to fire them. And he said, if I didn't fire them, I would get a call from Rupert within 10 minutes, meaning Rupert Murdoch. And he said to me at that time, he said 75% of my evening news division advertising revenues are coming from pharmaceutical companies. And he told me that of the 22 ads on the typical evening news show, that typically 17 or 18 of those were pharmaceutical ads. And so that, that tells it all. And I've seen again and again and again, people like Jake Tapper, who did this, he worked with me for 3 weeks doing this incredible documentary on an article that I published in 2005 about a secret meeting that DEC sponsored with 75 vaccine makers about how to hide from the American public the links between autism and vaccines. I obtained the transcript for these from those meetings, and I published them in Rolling Stone. And Jake Tapper, as the Rolling Stone publication date approached, he spent 3 weeks with me doing an exclusive for ABC, which he was then working for, on my article, a companion piece. And the night before the piece was supposed to run, he called me up and he said, the piece just got killed by corporate. And he said, in all my career, I have never had a piece killed by corporate, and I'm so mad. And then after that, I called him the next day, and he went dark. And I've never spoken to him again, but he's become kind of this shill for pharma since then. So, and I've watched that happen to so many, announcers on TV.
Think that's what happened to Tucker Carlson?
Well, I think it might be. I mean, the timing is good, but there was a lot of reasons they may have wanted to get rid of Tucker. But
it's a strange move, because I think Fox probably got rid of Fox News by getting rid of Tucker. It's a move that seems to be in.
They seem to have lost a big audience, and it is weird. I mean, Tucker was getting 4.5 million viewers a night. And compare that to CNN. CNN gets about the primetime CNN has 345,000 viewers. So Tucker was getting more than 10 times what CNN. He dwarfed anybody else on Fox. I mean, he was clearly the breadwinner. He was the anchor, and they fired him. They were making some kind of a point, and maybe he just pissed off Rupert by being, Fox News is important to us in this country, but to Rupert Murdoch's empire, it's just a drop in the bucket. So, and he may, who knows? It may have been pharma. It may have been Rupert Murdoch's ego. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, well, I wonder if a policy transformation that made it illegal for big pharma to market direct to consumer would go some distance to rectifying this pharma problem.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's right. And I looked into that. And, the change happened, Jordan, in 1997. And that's when FCC changed its rules and FDA approved, which was the rule before that was that there could be no direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products on TV or anywhere. And the only other nation in the world that allows that is New Zealand. And, because we have that rule, it's one of the reasons that we use 3 times the number of pharmaceutical drugs as any other European country. The average American today is on 4 pharmaceutical drugs, and it has not helped public health. It is, pharmaceutical drugs are now the 3rd largest killer of Americans after cancer and heart attacks. And we pay more for public health than any other country in the world. And I think,
right, so that means that's the 3rd leading cause of death is medical error. Is it 3rd or 4th?
I think it actually pharmaceutical drugs. I think it's pharmaceutical drugs. Yeah, and the source for that is the Cochrane collaboration. It's it's a report by Peter Gosha, I think, of the who is the founder of the Cochrane collaboration, which is kind of the ultimate arbiter of pharmaceutical companies.
Well, they're also the company that produced the recent report, the Cochrane Review, showing that masks are completely ineffective in relationship to COVID transmission.
Yeah.
Of course, that's being debated now, although I can't see how, because as you pointed out, the Cochrane Reviews people have accepted them as gold standard for conservative reviews, careful scientific reviews for years.
Yeah, the thing is that Bill Gates has played a huge role in trying to take over Cochrane. And they've got, they're the big founders of Cochrane, Thomas Jefferson, who is, the leading clinical trial expert in Europe, and Peter Gosha, who is the other co-founder, have both been run out of Cochrane. And the Gates Foundation has been pumping tens of millions of dollars in. So I don't know what's going to become of Cochrane now.
Yeah, well, the whole
but so people know, so that people know what we're losing is these were a group of very independent scientists who started looking at what was happening to the medical journals. The medical journals get most of their money from pharmaceutical companies for both advertising and preprints. Preprints are the pharmaceutical companies have these phony studies that they use their financial clout to get the Lancet, New England Journal of Medicine, or JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, to publish, and then they get a preprint. So they get the journal then to print out just that article, but with the cover of the journal in it, which gives it this imprimatur of total legitimacy. They print out 200,000 or 300,000 of them, and they pay a lot of money, millions of dollars for that run, that printing run from the Lancet. And then their pharmaceutical reps, the former Playboy models who go around to each doctor's office, take the doctor out to lunch and give him one of these preprints and say, look, the drug I'm doing, Lancet says it's a great thing. That's where these journals make all their money. Well, so in, I think it was the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, these groups of scientists got together who were independent scientists and said, what we're seeing now coming out of the journals is not real science, it's pharmaceutical propaganda. Even the journal editors like Marcia Engel from the New England Journal of Medicine, Richard Horton from the Lancet, said you cannot believe anything in the journals anymore. We are vessels for pharmaceutical propaganda. This group of scientists said, we're going to get volunteer scientists from all over the world who will now look over the journal articles and see whether it actually was good science or whether they're lying to us, and critically read it, do basically a second round of peer review that's real. And they put together this extraordinary organization of over 30,000 volunteer scientists, top scientists, independent scientists from around the world, who systematically review journal articles to see whether the science is real or fake and inform the public. And it was an absolutely critical organization. And, Gates has gone in there trying to undermine it. And it's very, very troubling.
Do you ever read the fine print that appears when you start browsing in incognito mode? It says that your activity might still be visible to your employer, your school, or your internet service provider. How can they even call it incognito? To really stop people from seeing the sites you visit, you need to do what we do and use ExpressVPN. Think about all the times you've used Wi-Fi at a coffee shop or a hotel. Without ExpressVPN, every site you visit could be logged by the admin of that network, and that's still true even when you're in incognito mode. Your home internet provider can also see and record your browsing data, and in the US, they're legally allowed to sell that data to advertisers. ExpressVPN is an app that encrypts all of your network data and reroutes it through a network of secure servers so that your private online activity stays just that, private. ExpressVPN works on all of your devices and is super easy to use. The app has one button. You tap it to connect, and your browsing activity is secure from prying eyes. So stop letting strangers invade your online privacy by visiting expressvpn.com/Jordan. That's expressvpn.com/Jordan and get 3 extra months free. expressvpn.com/Jordan.
A couple of questions. We talked here a little bit now about, let's say, the corruption of the legacy media on the news front by Big Pharma, and you just made reference to the same thing happening in the scientific domain, which is really awful to see journals like New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet and so forth, and Science for that matter, and you're seeing it with Nature as well, degenerate into organs that are no longer producing trustworthy science. That's a real catastrophe. You saw recently, like yesterday, that DeSantis basically bypassed the legacy media, and Pierre Poilievre did that in Canada when he ran for the leader of the Conservative Party, by the way. He just skipped over the legacy media entirely, and DeSantis announced his presidency on Twitter. And here you are also talking to me on YouTube, right? And so that's not exactly a standard political practice. And so what do you think of, why did you decide to talk to me today on my YouTube channel? And what do you think of DeSantis' use of Twitter? Has your campaign also been considering, for example, utilizing Twitter? Because obviously Musk has made that open to any candidate. And how are you guys conceptualizing your move forward on the presidency campaign front in relationship to non-traditional media?
Well, Jordan, I've been censored in the corporate media for 18 years. So since 2005, I've been actively censored, not only just for vaccine articles, but for all of my articles. And I was very, very active on those media fronts for, decades, but I've been slowly censored now to complete wall-to-wall censorship. And particularly during the last 3 years, we've had to figure out ways to get around that censorship. And so, we've done that by using non-traditional media. I was on Instagram. I had almost 1 million followers on Instagram at one point, but then in the pandemic, they deplatformed me. So I'm
right. You're still banned on Instagram. Is that the case?
Instagram and banned on TikTok. I'm interested to see what happens to you with YouTube because.
Well, they've left me alone. YouTube has left me alone. It's quite surprising because I've said things many times that in principle should have got me in trouble on YouTube, but they haven't even put any strikes against my channel. They demonetized my daughter for a whole year for reasons we never did discover, but they've been completely hands off with me. You know, they've added those warnings or clarifications now and then, especially when I talk to people like Bjorn Lomborg, and we'll get to that later. But I don't know what it is. YouTube has been hands off.
In answer to your question, when my uncle ran in 1960, television was a new phenomena, and he recognized the power of television, that would play a key role in that presidential campaign for the first time in history. And he was able to exploit that and to win that election. In the 2016 election, Twitter played a key role in getting Donald Trump elected. Absolutely critical. He probably would, if he didn't have that Twitter account, he probably would not have been elected. Who knows? But I would say there's a good chance he wouldn't. Today, Twitter is still important, and I have now 1.2 million followers on Twitter. I really didn't start actively doing Twitter until Elon freed it up. Because if during the pandemic, I was mainly posting, kitty cats and rainbows and unicorns, because if I said anything that was, if I talked about what I was thinking about, I would have been deplatformed. But once Elon took over, I started, they unshackled me. And, but also I think this year is going to be the political campaign that will be decided on by podcasts, and particularly because the candidates are not wanting to debate. So not only is Biden not debating, but I think Trump may not debate. So I think people like me are going to end up we're going to really test whether these podcasts. And, I was talking about Tucker having 4.5 million nightly views. Well, the podcast that Joe Rogan did with Peter McCulloch got 40 million views. So that,
right. Yeah, well, Rogan's a force of nature.
Yeah, so Tucker is 10 times what CNN gets, and Rogan's audience is potentially 10 times what Tucker was getting. So I think the podcasts have the capacity this election for reaching people and allowing, sort of dissident and insurgent candidates like myself to end run the corporate media monolith and to reach large numbers of Americans without going onto the networks. So I'm hoping that works. Now, you asked about DeSantis. I think, I felt badly for DeSantis, because of what happened on his, Twitter announcement where it went off, and I'm kind of rooting for Elon. So I don't obviously want DeSantis to win, but I do, I liked how he handled COVID in Florida. There's other things that he's doing now that I don't like. But I do, politics is hard for everybody, and it would be, I think it's unfortunate if somebody wants to speak to the American people and doesn't get that chance because the media vector is not, for some reason, is not able to reach them. I think he may have made a mistake in going on with Elon, but I don't know. Maybe not. I think President Trump is portraying DeSantis as a tool of the Jeb Bush. That's kind of his strategy for characterizing DeSantis as a tool of Wall Street and the billionaire class and, the Bushes, et cetera. And it may not have been, I think it probably would have been better for DeSantis I'm sure he thinks so now, if he had done a more traditional announcement where he would have gotten a lot of media coverage.
Yeah, well, like you said, well, time will tell, like you said, because it is a new technology and it is extraordinarily powerful in the way you described. I mean, Rogan's podcast is #1 in 97 countries. He's clearly the most powerful journalist who's ever lived. And so I think the legacy media in the United States will die first. And I think legacy media will die everywhere, but I already think it's probably dead in the United States. It's a walking corpse. And turning to podcasts and non-traditional media seems to me to be entirely appropriate for people who are forward-looking. Like I said, in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, who now runs the Conservative Party and who's the most likely next prime minister, he ran his entire campaign for leadership on non-traditional media, and he was producing ads on his own that were generating, 500,000 views, and people were voluntarily watching his ads, which was like 100 times the view count he would have got on our state-funded media, 69% state-funded media, CBC. And so, I think the tide has already turned and the U.S. is at the forefront of that. Now, here, I'm going to return to an earlier question I had. You've been on the receiving end of cancel culture. And one of the things I really have noticed is that, I have colleagues and compatriots, friends across the political spectrum. And one of the things I really have noticed that differentiates the left from the right is that the left will engage in cancel culture behavior to a degree that is virtually unheard of on the right. Now, that may change, but at the moment, that seems to be the case. Now, you've been on the receiving end of cancellation, as you said, for almost 20 years. And this begs the same question that I brought up earlier, is that why do you think, under those conditions, given the treatment that you've received, that the left is salvageable? Or do you revert to the idea, well, that's what we have to work with, and you're going to do what you can to revitalize the Democrat Party? Because it isn't obvious to me that this cancel culture phenomenon has gone so far that it isn't obvious to me how it can be turned around.
I don't think everybody on the left is, has co-signed counterculture. I think that's, it's a vocal. I think it's probably a vocal minority. I don't know. I have no reason. I have no reason to say that other than just that's my feeling. But I don't think most people think that way. That you should. I mean, it's anti-American. You don't. We should be courageous enough and confident enough of our viewpoint that we can argue them and have them triumph in the marketplace of ideas. And the way that you deal with, with viewpoints that you don't like or that you believe are inaccurate is not through censorship, but, with argument and more information and, and facts. And that's how we've always functioned. It's a critical foundation stone for democracy. This idea that the free flow of information is the water, it's the sunlight, it's the fertilizer for democracy, and if you cut it off, democracy itself will wither and die. There's just never been a time in history when when the good guys were the people who were censoring stuff. They're always the bad guys, and we know that. We read Orwell, and we read Aldous Huxley, and we read all of the great thinkers who were warning us from when we were little kids that the censors are bad, and when you start censoring people, then you're on the slippery slope to totalitarianism. I mean, in 1977, liberals in our country strongly supported the ACLU for going to bat for the Nazis who were walking through Skokie, Illinois, on a march through a Jewish neighborhood. And, we understood that we could be appalled by the things they were saying, but at the same time, that it was important for them to be able to say it. Because if somebody can shut them up, they can shut us up.
Well, I think your claim that it's a minority of radicals on the leftist side, I think the data supports that quite clearly. But okay, so let me tell you two stories and tell me what you think about this. So, when the Democrats I worked with in the U.S. in California, I had a conversation with them one day. Very intelligent people, by the way, about Antifa, and they were on about QAnon and about right-wing radical groups and. they regarded them as entirely real and entirely credible threats. And that was partly as a consequence of the January 6th occurrences, let's say. And so I said, well, what do you guys think of Antifa? And they said, well, they don't really exist. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because you think the right-wing conspirators exist, but you don't think the left-wing. But like I said, they were smart people, so I investigated further. And they said, well, it has no centralized organization. It's not a formal group. It's a very small minority of people. And it's extremely loosely structured, and it isn't representative of even the radical left, much less the centrist Democrats. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. So then I went and talked to Andy Ngo, who's a journalist who's covered Antifa in more detail than anyone else in the world, and who knows their organizational structure and their routines inside and out, and who's put his life on the line to cover this sort of this Antifa activity. And I asked him, how many Antifa cells do you think there are in the United States? And he said, well, there's probably about 20. And I said, well, how many full-time equivalent employees, so to speak, how many people do you think are in each cell that are dedicating themselves to the Antifa cause? And he said, well, maybe 40. And I said, oh, so that's 800 people. So that's 1 in 400,000. And, well, that's almost none. And so you could take that data and you could make the case the Democrats made, which is, well, the Antifa doesn't even exist. It's 1 in 400,000, In a city of 1 million, there'd be 2 Antifa members who were full-fledged, committed, full-time advocates. But then you think, well, look at all the damage those people did. And then you think, well, maybe it only takes a trivial minority of people who are off the rails to cause a tremendous amount of damage. That's what happened when the Soviets took over the Russian society in the aftermath of the monarchies after World War I. It was a tiny percentage of people. And this is what made me worried on the Democrat side. So this is why when I went to Washington, I pushed the Democrats that I talked to. He said, well, when do you think the left goes too far? And so let me ask you that question, like fairly bluntly. You're trying to pull the Democrats to the center. You think it's a salvageable enterprise, and you think it's necessary to salvage it. It's a 2-party system. It's half the country. When do you think the left goes too far? And how would you, in your administration, draw a line between those who are reasonable and who show common sense and those who have gone off the rail? Where is off the rail on the leftist side?
Well, under what circumstance would I be called upon to make that determination?
Well, okay, I can. Okay, so when the Biden administration took office, one of the things I also discussed with the Democrats I knew was how the positions that were going to be filled, that were now vacant because of the transition in the presidency, how those positions would be filled and who would they be filled with. And one of the things I was told was that there was a dearth of available bodies on the Democrat side. And, it's hard to get people involved in politics. And so that many of the positions were filled by people whose views were quite radical in comparison to the centrist, into the, say, mainstream centrist Democrat ideal. And so, and I see this as, I would say Kamala Harris is a good example of that, because I think Kamala Harris is inexcusably radical. She tweets out support for the notion of equity nonstop. And equity is not equality of opportunity. And so, I think you'll be called on to make those decisions. For example, if you did establish a presidency, when you were trying to figure out who was going to make up the bulk of your administration, and I know Democrats, because they like the free flow of ideas, have a hard time drawing distinguishing lines. And so they have a hard time distinguishing the centrists from the radicals, but they have been captured in many ways by the radical viewpoint. And it's very dangerous. You've been subject to that to some degree on the censorship side. And so I've not seen the Democrats contend seriously with the problem of how to differentiate the mainstream centrists from the dangerous radicals. And they seem to continue enabling them. I've seen that right now on the trans front, for example. Norway and Finland and Sweden and Holland and the UK have now banned gender transition surgery for minors. And yet it's still being promoted assiduously, for example, in California by Gavin Newsom. And I think that's criminal, personally. I think it's inexcusable. And that's a good example of the capture of the Democrats by the radicals, in my estimation. So it's a curious problem.
I have so many people right now who are flocking to my campaign that are high quality people that whose views about life and politics I respect. Some of them are Republicans, some of them are independents, some of them are Democrats. And I don't have any anxiety about being able to fill all the key positions in my administration with people who have, who I think have a common sense approach to life.
Okay, so you think you have a talent pool at hand that is broad enough so that you can find people who are qualified enough to occupy the centrist position appropriately and pull the Democrats back to, something more approximating the ideals, let's say, of the latter part of the 20th century as opposed to now. Okay, so let me ask you another question then. There are these ideas on the left that are troublesome, let's say. What do you think the central ideas on the left, what are the central ideas on the left that are troublesome in your estimation?
You know what I try to focus on, Jordan, is the values that Americans hold in common rather than, getting caught up in these issues that drive people apart. So that, I don't want to do finger pointing. If you ask me what I believe about certain issues, I'll tell you. But I'm not looking to finger point at people or to alienate people, or I'm trying to, run a campaign that brings people together rather than a campaign that tries, that is based upon, that kind of tribalism of condemning people for, for ideologies that I don't necessarily agree with. If they're relevant to something I'm doing, I'll take that into consideration. But I don't spend a lot of time I don't know. I really try to focus on how do you, where are the bridges where people can come together, Well,
I can understand that. I have this enterprise starting up in the Great Britain called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and we're trying to put together a positive vision for the future as opposed to the apocalyptic vision that's been circulating for some time now and that's demoralizing young people to a degree that's almost incomprehensible. And I can understand your concern for putting forward a positive vision rather than for drawing distinctions. But by the same token, for example, in the universities, I've seen the diversity, equity, and inclusivity advocates take the enterprise over and destroy it. And there are some truly pathological ideas circulating in that realm of the ideological space. And I'm not saying I know the answer to this because I have some sympathy for your desire to put forward a positive vision. But by the same token, it does seem to me to be incumbent upon the Democrats to draw a line. And I do think that one of the lines that should be drawn is with relationship to the notion of equity, because equity is a very pathological idea. And wherever it's been implemented around the world in the past, it's caused nothing but mayhem. And so, anyways, I won't push that any farther because, I have some appreciation for your perspective. I have another set of questions that I want to address. You mentioned at the beginning of our talk your concern that your concern in relationship to the use of fear. And we could say on the vaccine front that the vaccine mandates were pushed forward, especially the lockdown mandates, they were pushed forward with the use of fear, and that was conscious policy. I know in Canada, for example, that even the conservative types who were just as bad on the lockdown front, they polled the public. They made the public afraid first. Then they polled the public to find out what their fears were. Then they produced all sorts of lockdown regulations that were advanced to improve their standing in the polls. Then they told their scientists to justify those with scientific hypotheses post hoc. And so I've been thinking about that. So here's the conclusion. If there's a crisis that emerges, real or not, but let's say real, and your response to the crisis is that you become a fear-mongering tyrant, then you're the wrong leader for the time. Is that no matter what the crisis is, you are not morally it is not morally acceptable for you to use fear and compulsion to put your policy platform forward. And so I wanted to talk about that a bit on the climate front. I was actually concerned about talking to you today because I generally don't give my guests a rough time, but we, I think, have a profound difference of opinion in relationship to climate issues. And so one of the things that I've seen as I've traveled around the world is that the climate narrative, the apocalyptic climate narrative, we're destroying the planet and doom is nigh, has demoralized young people to a degree that's almost incomprehensible. I mean, you see it in the rising rates of depression and anxiety that characterize young women, and they're more susceptible to such things. But in men, you see it as this widespread dropping out of educational institutions and marriage and sexual relationships and employment. I think it's 20%, something like that. 20% of work-age men in the United States now haven't had any employment whatsoever in the last year. And I see this particularly paramount in Europe, where the climate apocalypse narrative has not only demoralized people en masse, especially young people, but it's produced a plethora of policies, and Germany's a canonical example, that have been, to put it mildly, counterproductive. So Germany has energy now that's 5 times as expensive as it should be. It's unreliable. They're dependent on the Russians and other totalitarians on the fossil fuel front, and they pollute more than they did before they started this whole green enterprise. And so I know that you're a long-term environmentalist and you're concerned on the climate front, but I've seen the climate apocalypse use fear to induce something approximating the same kind of level of tyranny, as far as I'm concerned, that characterized the vaccine lockdown. So help me sort that out, because you put forward a very interesting candidacy, and one of the crucial problems that we're facing at the moment is to sort out the environmental issues. Like, I'm a big admirer of people like Lomborg, for example, Bjorn Lomborg, who's put forward a multidimensional view of the environmental concerns that confront us, not reduced it to carbon excess, and not put forward an apocalyptic nightmare as the most likely scenario. So help me sort that out and understand where you stand.
Yeah, let me just start by with kind of a footnote. I see these huge levels of depression and despair, loneliness in kids. And I don't think that there's a single cause to it. And I think blaming it on, depression about climate is probably oversimplistic. And in fact, I think a lot of the problems we see in kids, and particularly boys, it's probably underappreciated that how much of that is coming from chemical exposures, including a lot of the sexual dysphoria that we're seeing. That these kids are being overwhelmed by a tsunami. I mean, they're swimming through a soup of toxic chemicals today, and many of those are endocrine disruptors. There's atrazine throughout our water supply. Atrazine, by the way, if you in a lab put atrazine in a tank full of frogs, it will chemically castrate and forcibly feminize every frog in there, and 10% of the frogs, the male frogs, will turn into fully viable females able to produce viable eggs. And if it's doing that to frogs, there's a lot of other evidence that it's doing it to human beings as well. So, and I'm happy to talk about that later, but I don't think blaming this epidemic of depression and despair on people who are fanning fears of climate I think that's oversimplistic. I think you're right. You put your finger on. First of all, let me just say this about climate. I believe that carbon in the atmosphere and methane does increase warming. Why do I believe that? I believe it because it makes sense, one, and I believe it because I read reports in the 1970s. On issues like vaccines, I read the science myself. I read it critically. I'm able to do that because I try cases on these issues, and I've been involved in probably more 500 to 700 cases, and almost all of them have some kind of scientific controversy. And so I wouldn't be good at my job if I couldn't read science critically. And all of my cases involve intense critical reading of science and cross-examination of scientists. And you have to have pretty much complete domain knowledge to be able to do that, and if you're going to win cases. So I'm used to doing that, and I've read, I would say, at least the abstracts for every vaccine study. I did a compilation of all the vaccine science involving thimerosal, where I digested 450 studies, the leading studies. I have 1,400 references in that book. That book was an earlier book I did called Thimerosal with the Science Speak. So I know if somebody asks me, I can tell you, this effect is highly likely being produced. I cannot do that with climate science. There's tens of thousands of studies. Most of them say yes. Virtually all of them say yes. Not all of them, but virtually all of them say that carbon is contributing to the warming. If you ask me, if your position is the warming's not happening, then that's like somebody saying the autism epidemic is not happening. You look around, you can see it everywhere. The ice caps are melting, et cetera, the Greenland ice sheet. I spend a lot of time outdoors, and I see over 69 years, I've seen the changes, and I've seen them, the mass migration of animals, of southern animals like black vultures and stuff, that, the northern increase in their ranges. I've seen the way that I've kept track since I was a kid about when the leaves turn. So, and it steadily moved up each year. And so I see that all of my senses are telling me that, the warming is occurring. Now, why is the warming occurring? There's people out there who say the warming's not occurring. There's other people who say, yeah, the warming's occurring. But it's not from carbon, trapping carbon. And my opinion, is basically, as I said, it's based on common sense, but also I read the science, the memos that I have read from the 1970s from Exxon scientists to Exxon management. Exxon during that time had what it bragged were the best scientists in the world who knew more about the fate of the carbon molecule in the atmosphere, in the environment, in every circumstance than any other scientist. And in the 70s, they were telling their management at Exxon, if we keep burning oil at this rate, we're going to warm the globe. It's high school math to them. And they said, it will be a good thing for the company. It will be a bad thing for humanity and for the wildlife and the planet. But it will be a good thing for the company because we're going to melt the Arctic. And there's a lot of oil under the Arctic, and we should be get ready to exploit it because it is going to be melted if we continue doing this. So, my feeling is if those were the top scientists in the world, they had no interest in lying about it. And this is what they were, saying. So I think it's probably more likely to be true than false. Now, I also agree. I want to say this because, and you asked me to interrupt you at the beginning.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
So, I want to respond to what you said. I agree 100% with you that this crisis is being used as a pretext for clamping down totalitarian controls the same way that the COVID crisis was. And it's the same people, it's intelligence agencies, it's the World Economic Forum, it's the Billionaires Boys Club at Davos. And it's the same kind of cabal of people who will use every crisis to stratify society toward, greater power for the super rich and greater power for the military, greater power for the intelligence apparatus, and less power for everybody else. And so, my approach to this, Jordan, is that I have a personal belief that the climate crisis is real. I do not insist that anybody else share my belief. And I feel like Lundgren is correct in saying that the climate orthodoxy gets it wrong, that the carbon orthodoxy, the people who ascribe to that get it wrong. There are actually a lot more important things than carbon. That is, than carbon sequestration and geoengineering. There's habitat preservation, the most important thing we can do. We've forgotten completely about that because of the obsession with reducing carbon. There's regenerative agriculture, which is absolutely critical, including for carbon sequestration, but also that we have good foods, that we preserve the soil, and all of these other impacts from a warming climate, which are, the shrinkage of lakes and agriculture, the destruction of soils and ecosystems. We need to do those things. And that the preservation of fisheries and all of these, which are all tied into climate, and the preservation of whales, for example, which in subtle ways also, but very, very certain, but almost unmeasurable ways, are part of the overall attack on the living planet, which is really the way that we need to look at this. And there's not just a war on carbon is not going to solve the problem if we don't have a habitat left at the end. So when I talk about these issues, I rarely talk about climate. I think we need to get rid of coal and oil, but I don't say we need to do that to save the climate because it's not convincing. And even if you say, tens of thousands of scientists agree with me, people today have a good reason to not believe scientific orthodoxies or pronouncements, right? We went through that in COVID where we were told, the science, the established science that said this is all real. And there's a lot of people who are saying, yeah, but it wasn't real and it isn't real. And showing somebody a graph and saying this is what's going to happen to you if you don't behave is not a good way to get good behavior, right? And it's going to happen to you in a long way. But the thing is that both Republicans and Democrats, I found in 40 years, love the environment. They want to keep sacred places. They want to have healthy food. They don't want toxics for their children. They don't want to see 22-story machines cutting down the Appalachian Mountains, and the 500 biggest peaks have been cut to the ground. An area of the Appalachians the size of Delaware has been leveled. These are our Purple Mountains, Majesty, where Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett roamed, and we are industrializing these landscapes so nothing will ever grow on them again. 2,200 miles of rivers has been filled. We have poisoned every freshwater fish in North America from discharges of mercury from coal-burning power plants. Nobody wants that. The high peaks of the Appalachians, the forest cover is gone from Georgia to northern Quebec because of acid rain. All of those high-altitude lakes are now sterile. Nobody wants that.
So how do you think we have Okay, so let me make a couple of things clear on my side, and then I'll ask.
And by the way, my approach to climate, my approach to reducing to energy, let's say my approach to energy, is using free markets and not top-down control. So what I would do is I would end subsidies, and then I would let marketplace determine. And what's going to happen is renewable energies is going to triumph because you can build a solar plant for $1 billion a gigawatt today. A wind plant costs about $1.2 billion. A coal plant costs $3.6 billion. And then dual cycle gas turbines cost probably a couple billion a gigawatt. But once you build a wind or solar, it's free energy forever. So it's always going to be cheaper. The problem with renewable energies like that is we do not have a transportation system to get them to market. So we need a marketplace. We need a grid system that can allow every individual in our country to become an energy entrepreneur, produce rooftop solar, sell it back to the grid at the same price that the utilities are getting, have every farmer in North Dakota be able to put wind turbines on their cornfields. They all want to do it. A cornfield in North Dakota is worth $800. A cornfield with a wind turbine on it's worth $3,200. Every farmer in North Dakota wants to put a wind turbine on their property. The problem is they cannot get those electrons to the markets in Cleveland, Cincinnati, St. Louis, New York, because we do not have an efficient grid system, and we need to build that the same as Eisenhower did with the highway system when I was a kid. We need to build a grid system that will create a marketplace. And once we have that marketplace, we'll have free energy forever. Just like when we built the ARPANET grid, for information, the cost of information went to zero. We built the telecom grid, the cost of phone calls went to zero. When we build an energy grid, the cost of electrons will go to zero. And that will be a huge economic boom for our country, and nobody's going to be using oil and coal anymore.
Okay, so you agreed that there is a danger on the environment apocalypse front, that the same old criminals, let's say, will utilize that potential crisis for tyrannical ends. And so let's leave that aside. That's something we agree on. I should point out that, and as Lomberg does, I accept the IPCC projections that there'll be some temperature increase over the next 100 years, and that some proportion of that is a consequence of man-made activity. Now, Lomberg has produced economic projections based on current rates of GDP growth, showing that, I'm not going to get the figures exactly right, but this is close to right, that in 100 years from now, we'll be about 400% richer than we are now. But with the negative consequences of climate transformation, we'll be 350% richer. And that's not nothing. There's some actual decrement in potential future value as a consequence of that. But it's within the range that we can actually intelligently manage. And he's also documented quite well the host of environmental concerns that confront us in a manner that's very similar to what you just did. It's like we don't have one problem on the environmental front. We have many problems, and we should deal with them intelligently. How do you think that it's possible to have a discussion about the environmental challenges that confront us without opening the door to the people who are going to use fear to introduce tyranny? And is this associated with, in some manner, with your notion of a positive vision? Because what is happening, and I see this happen in Europe, it's crystal clear, and this is especially the case in Germany, although it's also true in the UK, is that these more tyrannical policies on the energy front, they're not looming, they're already in place, and they're really hurting poor people, really badly, and destabilizing the entire power grid and deindustrializing Germany, which is also part of the plan for some people. How can we confront the environmental issues that do in fact loom in front of us without inviting in that top-down tyrannical control?
Well, I think that's what I'm trying to do with my candidacy, is to reboot some of this so that that we can find a common ground, that people can understand that you can love the environment. The reason that I became an environmentalist, Jordan, was not because I was scared of something, scared of the end of the world. It was because I was in love with the creeks and and climbing the trees to get a baby crow when I was a kid, and training hawks and doing whitewater kayaking and the little streams and creeks around my home where I could go and turn over rocks and find mud puppies and salamanders and crayfish and collect them and bring them home, or seeing the tadpoles bubbling in these little mud puddles that became cauldrons in the early spring, stuff my kids will never see, the explosion of color from the butterflies when I walked into the garden that my kids will never see. Because those, they're gone now. And that's why I fell in love with the environment, and it was out of love. It was not out of fear. And I think we have to bring people back to that place of love and say, what kind of world do we want to live in? Is it a world where we can hear the songbirds and where there's amphibians out in the road and you can still see box turtles? Or is it, are we, either side is trying to make us fearful, and fear is not you never get a good response from fear. You never get, so I think we have to appeal to people through that love, through that kind of appeal. And that, my whole career has been doing that. I had a chance in 1983, when I switched careers and became a full-time, I've always been an environmentalist, but when I became a full-time environmental attorney and advocate, I was given a choice of going to Washington and working for an inside the Beltway, at a high level, doing lobbying, doing, fundraising, and doing maybe land conservation on a grand scale. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to work with, communities that were living in the environment and that had been marginalized by environmentalists. My first case as an environmental lawyer was for the NAACP, blocking a waste transfer station that had been sited in the oldest black neighborhood in the Hudson Valley because they didn't have the political power. And I saw that then, and I saw that 4 out of every 5 toxic waste dumps in America was in a black neighborhood. The largest toxic waste dump in America is Emile, Alabama, which is 85% black. The highest concentration of toxic waste dumps in North America is the south side of Chicago. The most contaminated zip code in California is East LA. It was all Hispanic neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, where these obnoxious, dangerous, toxic facilities were being sited. And then I went to work for, what was my passion for most of my life, which was for fishermen on the Hudson River, commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen. Most of these people were Republicans. They're people who were environmentalists, as radical as you can get, but they didn't call themselves that because they felt estranged from the mainstream environmental community. They were people whose livelihoods, depended on a clean environment, who love the fisheries, their property values, their recreation. These are people who were never going to see Yosemite or Yellowstone National Park. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the swimming holes, the fishing holes of the Hudson River that was there. It was Richie Garrett, who was the founder of the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, which I, joined and later turned into Riverkeeper. He used to say about the Hudson, it's our Riviera, it's our Monte Carlo. He was a combat veteran from Korea, and he was a full-time gravedigger. These were people who were the salt of the earth. And they should have been environmentalists, but they felt estranged from the environmental community. And I spent my livelihood with the hook and bullet people, bringing them into the environmental movement. And they came in because of love, not because of fear.
Right. So you're willing to avoid, or would like to avoid, using fear as a motivating factor when you're making your case for environmental concerns. Okay, well, that seems to be a good answer on the motivational front.
The reason that FDR said the only thing that we have to fear is fear itself, and he said that, it wasn't during World War II, it was in 1932. And he said that because the Depression had landed, in the United States and Europe, and he saw we had left-wing leaders, demagogues like Huey Long, that a third of the country wanted to turn, essentially socialist or communist. We had a right-wing, like Father Charles Coughlin, who wanted to bring the nation fascist. The people had lost faith in democracy. It was 1 out of every 4 Americans was unemployed. 2,200 banks had closed. It was crashing, and everybody was convinced that democracy and capitalism had failed. We had to look for a new system. In Europe, Roosevelt saw the same depression. The reaction in Germany and Spain and Italy was that right-wing tyrants were using fear to engineer a shift to the far right and to fascism. And in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, left-wing tyrants were doing the same thing, but to shift the population towards communism. And that's why he said to the American people, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. We can right this, we can change it, we can recover what we had, but we just have to stay out of fear, because that is the weapon of tyrants.
Okay, so we're going to run out of time on this side. There's 2 other questions I'd like to pose. We don't have a lot of time for them, and I'll put both questions forward. The first would be, why should Democrats prefer you to Biden? And the second question is, what are your opinions on the Russia-Ukraine situation? So let's start with, if you don't mind, let's start with the Biden situation. Why should Democrats, they have an incumbent president, And why should Democrats prefer you to Biden?
Well, I mean, philosophically, we're at other, opposite ends of the party. President Biden believes in, the Ukraine war, which I think is I think it's a huge. What we're doing in the Ukraine now is just a massive assault on Ukrainians, and that we have trapped Ukraine in a proxy war against the Soviets, and they are being devoured by these geopolitical machinations of neocons in the White House who have this comic book depiction that, a lot of Americans have swallowed about, what is happening in the war, but what's really, and let me just say something about the war. I think Americans supported that war for all the right reasons because, Abraham Lincoln said we are a great nation because we're a good nation. I think Americans are good people. They have compassion toward Ukrainian people, an illegal invasion and brutal invasion by, a man who is a homicidal tyrant. And they saw and they had, tremendous admiration for the valor and the courage of the Ukrainian people. My son, Connor, at 26 years old, left law school without telling us and went to the Ukraine and joined the Foreign Legion and fought in a special forces group as a machine gunner during the Kharkiv offensive. And he was motivated by that goodness that so many Americans have. But we were told that this was a humanitarian mission. And yet every step that we have taken, every decision we have been made appears to have been intended to prolong the war and to increase the bloodshed. And President Biden has, recently confessed that our purpose is to depose Vladimir Putin, which is the 2-decade aspiration of the neocons who surround him. They've been saying that for decades. They've also been saying, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was their doyen and philosopher, said that the U.S. strategy should be to suck Russia into a series of wars in little countries where we can then exhaust them. Lloyd Austin, who is President Biden's defense secretary, in April 2022 said, our purpose for being in the Ukraine is to degrade the Russian army, to exhaust it, and degrade its capacity to fight anywhere in the world. Well, that is the opposite of a humanitarian mission. That is a war of attrition, and that's what it's turned out to be. We have now turned Ukraine into an abattoir that has devoured 350,000 young Ukrainians. They are lying about how many people have died. They're concealing it from us. They're concealing it from the Pentagon's concealing it from the American people. The Ukraine is concealing it from them people, but 350,000 people. Russians are killing Ukrainians at a ratio of 7 to 1. And we have turned that poor little nation into, just a killing field for these idealistic young kids. And in order to advance a geopolitical agenda that, has nothing to do with the Ukraine.
Okay, so it seems to me that your summary, from what I know, your summary of the rationale for the war is accurate, is that the hypothesis on the pro-war with Russia front, let's say, is that it's a worthwhile expenditure of American money to take Russia out as a conventional military power. And I do believe that's what's happening. And there's a side benefit to that, which is the funneling of billions of dollars into Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. And so
yeah, it's a money laundering scheme for the military-industrial complex.
Right. Okay. But now, so I could say, well, what's wrong with the goal of degrading Russia's conventional military policy? Why is that not in the best interests, let's say, of the West? And what do you see it as an alternative? And what would you do in relationship to the Russia-Ukraine conflict if you had, well, the decision-making power to actually do something about it? I know there's no peace talks going on at the moment, for example, which is quite a miracle.
And the Russians have wanted to do peace talks from the beginning, and we've rebuffed them.
Right.
I will settle this on day one. I will stop the killing on day one. I'll stop the killing, and the settlement is obvious, right? The Russians have wanted to settle this from the beginning, and they've been very clear about what they want. They want NATO to make a pledge to not come into the Ukraine, which we should have done. We shouldn't have put NATO into 14 countries. We told the Russians when they dismantled the Soviet Union in 1991, and they moved 400,000 troops out of East Germany, and they allowed NATO to reunify Germany under NATO. And they said our condition for doing that, this tremendous conciliation that we're making, is that you never move NATO to the east. And George Bush told them, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski laid out the plan, which has then happened, where we moved it not 1 inch, but 1,000 miles to the east, 14 nations. And then we put Aegis missile systems in Poland and Romania, which are nuclear capable. So they're a few minutes from Russia. They can decapitate the entire Russian leadership before, if we wanted to start a preemptive war. And that is inexcusable. I mean, we wouldn't live with that. My uncle did not live with that in 1962. We would have gone in. If they hadn't removed them from Cuba, we would have gone in. And then we overthrew the democratically elected government, Viktor Yanukovych, in 2014. We spent $5 billion. The CIA, through USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy, spent $5 billion to violently overthrow that government, and which was democratically elected. So we destroyed this democracy and put in our own government, which we now know the neocons in the White House, Victoria Nuland, selected 2 months before in a telephone. So we handpicked the new government before the coup. We put a new government in that immediately makes a civil war against the Russian population of Donbass, bans the Russian language, kills 14,000 of them, and then starts training with NATO. And there were a lot of provocations. It's not just me saying this. George Kennan, who is the architect of, the entire Cold War containment policy, said in 1998, the year after Brzezinski wrote that memo, he said, it is the greatest calamity ever to expand NATO to the east. He said, Russia lost the Cold War. The people who are running Russia are the ones who oppose the Cold War. We should be making friends with them. We shouldn't be pushing them into the hands of China.
Okay, Mr. Kennedy, let me summarize. We're going to run out of time, and I want to be very respectful of your time. I know you have a tight deadline. So I want to summarize what we've talked about, and if you have any closing remarks, and give you an opportunity to do that. So we started out by talking about the necessity for your presidency and the twist in the tail of the Democratic Party and your notion, which you reiterated later, that you're on the opposite side of the political spectrum within the Democrats from Biden, and that what you would like to do is to pull the party back to its more traditional center. And we talked about the capture of the legacy media and your censorship and the potential movement of political dialogue into alternative forms. We talked about environmental issues and came to an agreement, for example, that there are other fish to fry than the carbon fish, let's say, and that the use of fear in the environmental movement is an invitation to totalitarianism. And we essentially concluded with a discussion of the Russia-Ukraine war, which you characterized as an attempt by the neocons to degrade Russian military capacity. And you made a case for how we, in some ways, set up the Russians to engage in this conflict. And so and in doing so, in doing all of that, you laid out some of the principles of your candidacy and described why you regard yourself as a credible and necessary alternative to Biden. And so 2 questions. Did I summarize that properly? And is there anything else that you would like to bring to the attention of people before we draw this part of this to a close?
I don't think I want to start another long discussion with you, but there's plenty more to talk about if you want to have me back another time. And that was a fine summary, Jordan.
Okay, well, look, we will definitely continue this discussion because, well, why not? There's lots of other things to talk about. And so, okay, so then I would like to thank you for sitting down and talking to me today. I would like to talk to you at some point about this vision that we're developing for this ARC enterprise in London, and trying to put forward a positive vision of the future instead of the apocalyptic nightmare, you must turn to tyranny vision, which I think is ruling at the moment. And so we can do that in the future. For everybody who's watching and listening on YouTube, thank you very much for your time and attention. And to the Daily Wire Plus folks for facilitating this conversation, setting up this studio in Edmonton, Alberta. That's where I am today. And then the studio also. Where are you located at the moment, Mr. Kennedy?
Indianapolis, Indiana, the home of the Indianapolis Speedway, which is at this moment running their annual race.
Well, thank you for everyone setting that up on that front. I'm going to talk to Mr. Kennedy for another half an hour on the Daily Wire Plus platform. We'll do a more biographical interview on that end of things. And so if you're interested, please consider turning to that. Apart from that, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me today. And I'm looking forward, hopefully at some point, to meeting in person, but also to continuing our discussion if you're open to that in the future.
Absolutely, anytime. Thank you for having me, Jordan.
Hello, everyone. I would encourage you to continue listening to my conversation with my guest on dailywireplus.com.